The road to Mordmere had been swallowed by the forest hours ago. Lena Voss's rented car jolted over roots that seemed to deliberately rise from the earth, as if the woods themselves resisted visitors. When she finally emerged into the village clearing, the sudden hush was unnerving. No birds, no insects, just the whisper of leaves and the distant creak of a rusted weather vane. Mordmere looked like a painting left in the attic too long. The thatched cottages slumped under the weight of centuries, their windows dark despite the fading afternoon light. The inn, the Hare and Hollow, leaned precariously over the village square, its sign swaying in the wind. The hare in the illustration had no eyes. Inside, the air smelled of damp wool and wood smoke. A dozen villagers sat at rough-hewn tables, their conversations dying when Lena entered. No one looked up for long, just quick, furtive glances before returning to their drinks. The innkeeper, a broad-shouldered man with hands like knotted rope, wiped the counter with slow, deliberate strokes. "Room for 3 nights," Lena said, sliding her credit card across the polished oak. The name Lena Voss, Ph.D., was embossed on the plastic in crisp silver letters. The innkeeper hesitated. Then, with visible reluctance, he pulled out the guest book, a massive leather-bound tome that smelled faintly of mildew. The pages were yellowed, filled with names in faded ink. Lena signed with a flourish. The ink vanished before her eyes, not smudged, not erased, gone, as if the paper had thirsted for it. The innkeeper's jaw tightened. He said nothing, only slid a key across the counter. It was cold, far colder than metal should be. Upstairs, Lena found her room sparse but clean. The mirror above the wash basin was covered with a black cloth. She pulled it aside. For one heart-stopping second, her reflection didn't move. Then it blinked. She yanked the cloth back into place. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the faint, rhythmic sound of something scratching at the village gates. The village elder, Grandmother Birch, had agreed to meet Lena at midnight, a time that felt too deliberate to be coincidence. The path to her cottage wound through the heart of Mordmere, where the houses seemed to lean closer together the farther Lena walked, their darkened windows like watching eyes. The only light came from the occasional flicker of a candle behind thick curtains, though no shadows moved within. Grandmother Birch's home stood apart from the others, a crooked little dwelling half buried in ivy, its chimney puffing pale smoke into the starless sky. The door was already ajar when Lena arrived, as if she'd been expected. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs and something faintly metallic. Old blood, perhaps, or rust. The walls were lined with shelves of jars, each containing what looked like curled slips of parchment. Grandmother Birch sat hunched in a rocking chair by the fire, her gnarled fingers working a needle through a half-finished embroidery hoop. The design was intricate, a sprawling oak tree, its roots twisting into letters that spelled birch at the base. "You're here for the stories," the old woman said, not looking up. Her voice was like dry leaves skittering across stone. Lena nodded, setting her recorder on the table between them. "I want to document Mordmere's history before it's forgotten." A slow, knowing smile crept across Grandmother Birch's face. "Nothing is ever forgotten here," she murmured. "Only misplaced." The interview began. The elder spoke of the village's founding, of old bargains made with things that lurked beyond the trees. She spoke in riddles, her words careful, as if even language could be dangerous here. Every so often, her needle would pause, and she'd glance toward the window, as though something outside listened. Then, just as Lena asked about the disappearing names, the fire guttered. The room plunged into darkness. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, a whisper, so close it brushed Lena's ear. "Run!" When the candlelight returned, Grandmother Birch was gone. Not fled, vanished. The embroidery hoop lay abandoned in the chair, the threads of her name now loose and frayed, as if they had never been stitched at all. And outside, beneath the creak of branches, something chuckled. Dawn came reluctantly to Mordmere, the sun bleeding through the mist like a stain on wool. Lena hadn't slept. She sat in the village square, Grandmother Birch's frayed embroidery clutched in her hands, watching as the villagers went about their morning routines with eerie normalcy. No one mentioned the missing elder. No one seemed to remember her at all. The church stood at the edge of the village, its steeple leaning like a broken finger pointing accusingly at the sky. The priest, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and a voice like rustling parchment, had avoided Lena's questions all morning, but when she showed him the unraveled embroidery, his face went ashen. "Come," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder at the milling villagers. "But leave that here." He kicked at the embroidery as if it were a venomous thing. He led her through the vestry, past a tapestry of the Last Supper, where the faces of the apostles had been meticulously unpicked from the cloth. A rusted iron door stood hidden behind it, its surface etched with warnings Lena couldn't decipher. The priest produced a key from around his neck, its teeth jagged like a wolf's grin. The air that rushed out was tomb cold and carried the scent of old ink and something sweetly rotten. The priest lit a lantern, revealing a cavernous chamber beneath the church. Shelves stretched into the darkness, each one lined with objects, a pocket watch, a child's doll, a wedding ring, all tagged with names that made Lena's breath catch. James, Emily, Thomas. "These are the ones we gave," the priest whispered, running a finger along a dusty music box labeled Eleanor. "The forest takes the name, but sometimes it leaves the bones behind." At the center of the room stood a great ledger, its pages filled with entries in dozens of different hands. Lena flipped it open to the most recent page. Birch, Agatha, given this 3rd day of October. The ink was still wet. Lena's voice shook. "You trade them?" The priest's eyes gleamed in the lantern light. "We survive." Somewhere above them, the church bell tolled, a single, mournful note. The priest stiffened. "They know you're down here," he said, and then the whispering began. The moon hung low over Mordmere, swollen and yellow like a diseased eye. Lena crouched in the bracken at the forest's edge, her breath shallow, her clothes damp with dew. The villagers had been gathering in silence for nearly an hour, their lanterns snuffed out one by one as they reached the standing stones. There were 13 stones in total, their surfaces pitted with symbols that made Lena's eyes ache to look at. At their center stood a family, a hollow-eyed couple clutching a swaddled newborn. The mother's fingers trembled as she stroked the infant's cheek. The priest stepped forward, his usual robes replaced by a patchwork cloak stitched together from what looked like scraps of old clothing, each frayed edge marked with faded initials. In his hands, he carried a glass jar, its lid studded with rusted nails. "Name the child," he intoned. The father's voice cracked as he whispered into the baby's ear. The words were too soft for Lena to hear, but the forest seemed to lean in closer, branches creaking in anticipation. The priest pressed the jar to the infant's lips. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a wisp of silver smoke curled from the baby's mouth, coiling like a living thing into the jar. The priest slammed the lid shut just as the child began to wail, the sound too sharp, too knowing for a newborn. Around them, the villagers exhaled as one, their shoulders slumping with relief. The standing stones hummed, a vibration that traveled up Lena's spine and settled behind her teeth like the aftertaste of lightning. Then, the impossible happened. Across the village, the roof of the family's crumbling cottage straightened. Rotting timbers regrew like blooming flowers. The well in their yard, dry for a generation, gurgled to life with the sound of rushing water. The priest held the jar aloft, the silver mist inside swirling violently. "Accepted," he declared. And with that, he turned and hurled the jar into the forest. Something caught it. Lena didn't see what. Only the briefest impression of long, branch-like fingers snatching the jar from the air before the undergrowth swallowed it whole. The villagers dispersed without a word, their faces slack with something between gratitude and grief. Only the mother hesitated, her hand hovering over the baby's face, as if searching for features she could no longer quite recall. Back in her room at the inn, Lena found the first patch of fogged skin on her wrist. When she rubbed at it, her own name stuttered on her tongue. The fog had crept into Lena's bones. She woke with patches of her skin turned translucent, like parchment held up to candlelight. When she tried to speak her name into the mirror, the syllables dissolved on her tongue. Lee, Na, as if something were plucking the letters from the air before they could fully form. The villagers were waiting for her downstairs. They filled the common room of the Hare and Hollow, their faces blurred at the edges like unfinished portraits. The innkeeper stood at the forefront, his broad hands clenched around a rusted key. Behind him, the priest clutched the great ledger from the archive, its pages fluttering despite the still air. "You weren't supposed to see," the innkeeper said. His voice had changed, less human now, more like the creak of a tree bending under snow. Lena's notebook lay open on the table, her research notes meticulously detailed. But where her name should have been at the top of each page, only blank spaces remained. The priest stepped forward, running a finger along one of the empty lines. "You have two choices," he murmured. "Leave now and forget." A murmur rippled through the villagers. Their mouths moved, but the words were wrong. Not speech, but the sound of wind through dead grass. "Or stay," the innkeeper continued, "and become the new keeper of the archive." He held out the key. It pulsed faintly in his palm, as though something alive slept inside the metal. Lena's vision swam. The fog under her skin thickened, tendrils of it curling around her wrists like shackles. She understood now. The role of storyteller was a slow sacrifice. The keeper remembered every lost name, every traded soul, until the weight of them dissolved their own. Grandmother Birch hadn't disappeared. She'd erased. Outside, the forest sighed, its branches scraping against the inn's walls in anticipation. The key burned in Lena's palm like a shard of ice as she descended into the archive. The villagers had not followed. They never did. Not here. Not into this tomb of lost things. The air smelled of damp parchment and the sweet cloying rot of forgotten flowers. The great ledger lay open on its pedestal, its pages blank save for the last entry. Birch, Agatha. The ink had dried black as a starless sky. Lena set her lantern down. The light flickered, casting monstrous shadows that crawled up the shelves of tagged belongings, each one a grave marker for a soul the world would never remember. She picked up the pen. It trembled in her grip, heavier than any tool had a right to be. She began to write. Not the village's history, not the names of the lost, her own story. Lena Voss came to Mordmere on the 3rd of October. She saw what they did. She remembers. The ink pooled dark, then faded, the letters unraveling like thread from a spool. She wrote them again, and again. Each time, they lasted a heartbeat longer before disappearing. Somewhere above, the wind rose to a shriek. The shelves trembled. Glass jars rattled as the things inside, the last whispers of stolen names, stirred in their prisons. Lena's fingers had gone translucent to the second knuckle. She could see the pen through her flesh. "Still," she wrote, "my name is Lena Voss." The words held. For a moment, just a moment, they burned gold against the page. Then the ledger snapped shut with a sound like a breaking bone. The lantern guttered out. In the dark, Something sighed, a sound of terrible satisfaction. When the light returned, had it been seconds, hours, the ledger lay open once more. The page read, "Recorded by the storyteller." Of Lena, there was no sign. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one. Bye for now.